They said Margaret Garner lost her mind. That was the easiest lie to tell. When federal marshals smashed through the door of a small cabin near Cincinnati in February of 1856, they did not find a monster. They found a mother kneeling on a dirt floor holding her dead child while the air still smelled of blood and cold river ice. Margaret did not scream. She did not run. She looked at them with eyes so calm it unsettled the men who had come to drag her back into slavery. The newspapers called it a tragedy. The courts called it a property dispute. History tried to forget it. But what happened in that cabin exposed something America was never meant to face. A truth so dangerous it had to be buried under legal language and silence. Tonight you will hear the story they tried to erase. Now let us go back to the beginning. Kentucky. Winter of 1856. The Ohio River was more than water. It was a border between two worlds. On one side stood Kentucky, where the law said human beings could be owned like tools or animals. On the other side stood Ohio, where freedom was supposed to exist. But freedom depended on where your feet touched the ground. In summer the river flowed slow and muddy. In winter it froze into a hard white path that cracked and groaned at night like something alive. People who lived near it said the ice made sounds like voices. Some claimed it was only nature. Others believed it was the echoes of those who had tried to cross and never survived. Margaret Garner was born enslaved around the year 1834 on the Maplewood plantation in Boone County, Kentucky. No one wrote down the exact date. Enslaved children were not recorded with care. Her life began without a birth certificate and almost without a name. Her mother Priscilla had been sold as a girl after her owner died. She arrived at Maplewood alone with no family left to remember. Slavery erased people from their past until they stopped trying to hold on to it. Margaret grew up knowing hunger, cold and fear. She also grew up knowing something else. The truth about her father. No one said his name, but everyone knew. The master's son Archibald Gaines visited the slave cabins at night. Children born months later carried his light skin and sharp features. Margaret was one of them. That made her dangerous. She was smart. She noticed things. Overseers did not like enslaved people who watched too closely. Thinking led to questions and questions led to resistance. Maplewood was not small. 800 acres of crops worked by over 50 enslaved people. The main house sat high on a hill so the owner could watch the cabins at all times. Control was built into the land itself. Margaret lived in a cramped wooden cabin with her mother, relatives and many children. There was no privacy, only survival. Nights were filled with whispered prayers, crying babies and the sounds of pain that no one dared question. At 19, Margaret married Robert Garner. Their marriage was not legal, but it was real. They jumped the broom in front of their community knowing the law could tear them apart at any moment. Robert belonged to a neighboring plantation. He was strong, quiet and scarred by years of forced labor. He had already been sold twice in his life. He knew better than to hope. But he loved Margaret fiercely because love was the only thing slavery could not fully take. They had 4 children, Mary, Thomas, Samuel and baby Priscilla. Margaret loved them with a fear that never left her chest. She had seen mothers lose children to the auction block. She had seen women break from the pain. She promised herself her children would never live that fate. The owner, John Pollard Gaines, was not known as a cruel man. That was what made him dangerous. He believed himself kind. He went to church. He sang hymns. He owned people and saw no contradiction. But kindness does not matter when money disappears. By the winter of 1856, Gaines was drowning in debt. Tobacco prices collapsed. Investments failed. And when a slave owner lost money, he sold human beings to recover it. Whispers spread through the cabins. People were going south. South meant cotton and sugar plantations where life expectancy was short and suffering was constant. South meant death. Margaret heard her name on the list. So were Robert and the children. That was the moment she decided. The Ohio River froze solid that January. Thick ice stretched from shore to shore. It was rare, it was dangerous, and it was an opportunity that might never come again. Robert made contact with a free black man in Cincinnati named Elijah Kite. He was part of a hidden network of people who helped enslaved families escape. They did not write names down. They spoke in coded words and silence. The plan spread through whispers in the dark. One night, one crossing, no turning back. Margaret held her children close and listened to the river groan outside. She knew the risk. She also knew the alternative. Slavery would take her children piece by piece until nothing was left. Freedom or death. On a freezing night with the moon hidden behind clouds, Margaret, Robert and several others slipped away from the plantation. Bare feet touched ice that cracked beneath them. Every step sounded too loud. Every breath burned. They crossed the river into Ohio believing they had reached safety. They were wrong. Within days slave catchers and federal marshals were on their trail. The law followed them across the ice because the law protected property, not people. And when they reached the cabin near Mill Creek, everything changed. That is where part 2 begins. Because what Margaret Garner did next forced America to choose between the law and humanity. And it chose the law. For now. If you want to hear the rest of this story, the one history tried to bury, stay with me. This is not just a story about the past. It is a warning. Part 2 is coming. Part 2. Freedom lasted less than one night. The sun had not fully risen when the pounding started. Not a knock. Not a warning. A violent assault on the door that shook the cabin walls and ripped hope apart in an instant. Margaret woke with her heart already racing because some part of her had known this moment was coming. You do not escape slavery without the law chasing you. Before anyone could speak, the door burst inward. Wood splintered and fell. Cold air rushed into the cabin along with 6 armed federal marshals. Their boots struck the floor like drumbeats of judgment. Behind them stood the men who owned Margaret's life. John Pollard Gaines, James Marshall. The law had followed them across the river. Robert moved first. He stepped in front of Margaret and the children like his body alone might stop what was coming. One marshal slammed him into the wall so hard the cabin shook. Another grabbed Simon. Mary screamed when her husband fell. The children woke crying, confused, terrified, pulled from sleep into chaos. Margaret stood frozen for a heartbeat too long. Then instinct took over. She pulled her children close, clutching baby Priscilla against her chest. Her mind raced not with panic but with clarity, sharp and cold. This was it. This was the moment every enslaved mother feared. The moment when men with papers and guns decided the future of her children. One marshal shouted orders. Another read from a document with no emotion. The Fugitive Slave Act. Property recovered. Resistance punishable by force. Margaret did not hear most of it. She heard only the sound of chains being pulled from belts. She saw the way Gaines looked at her children, not as lives but as numbers. As value. As things that could be sold. Mary clung to her leg crying. Thomas and Samuel screamed as hands reached for them. Robert fought back until a fist struck his face and blood filled his mouth. In that chaos, Margaret made a choice. Not a sudden choice. Not a moment of madness. A decision shaped by years of fear, whispers and promises made in the dark. She would not let them take her children alive. Margaret moved fast. Faster than anyone expected. She grabbed a butcher knife from the table where Sarah Kite had been preparing food. In one motion she pulled Mary away from the men and ran toward the back of the cabin. Shouts erupted behind her. Someone grabbed at her dress but missed. Margaret closed the door to the small back room and pressed her daughter against her chest. Mary was crying, asking questions Margaret could not answer. Margaret whispered words of love, words of apology, words of promise. Then she acted. The sound that followed was not loud. Not dramatic. Just a sharp gasp and silence. When the marshals broke down the second door, they found Margaret kneeling on the floor. Blood soaked into the dirt. Mary lay still in her arms. Margaret's face was calm. Terribly calm. She looked up at them and spoke words that froze the room. She said she would have killed them all if she had time. The marshals stepped back, shaken. They had expected hysteria, screaming, madness. What they saw instead was resolve. Purpose. A woman who believed death was kinder than slavery. They dragged Margaret away from the body. She fought, then stopped. Her strength was gone. Her children screamed as they were torn from her arms. Baby Priscilla cried weakly, her earlier medicine still heavy in her blood. Outside, neighbors gathered. Word spread fast. A white child killed would have brought rage. A black child killed brought silence and discomfort. This was not supposed to happen. Gaines was furious, not because of the death but because of the loss. Mary had been valuable. A light-skinned child fetched a higher price. The newspapers would later avoid that truth. They called it a domestic tragedy. They said Margaret had lost her mind. They did not say what she was trying to protect. Margaret was taken to jail in Cincinnati. Not as a murderer but as stolen property. That distinction mattered, because if she was tried for murder she would be recognized as a person. If she was treated as property she would be returned to Kentucky. That was the battle to come. The jail cell was cold, damp and crowded. Margaret sat alone staring at her hands still stained dark. She did not cry. She did not ask forgiveness. When asked why she did it she answered simply. She said she would rather see her child dead than enslaved. Those words spread like fire. Abolitionists rushed to her defense. Ministers, lawyers, journalists. They understood the danger. If Margaret was tried for murder the entire system of slavery would be forced into the open. The country would have to admit what slavery did to a mother's mind. Slave owners panicked. They demanded her return. They demanded silence. They demanded the law do what it was designed to do. The courtroom filled with people who had never cared about enslaved lives before. Witnesses contradicted each other. Testimonies changed. Records vanished. Nothing about the case stayed clean or simple. Because the truth was too ugly. Margaret sat quietly through it all. She did not beg. She did not apologize. She had crossed a line no one wanted to acknowledge. She had chosen her children over the nation's laws. And the nation could not forgive that. Outside the jail crowds gathered. Some prayed. Some cursed. Some stared in silence. The country was watching even if it did not fully understand what it was seeing. This was not just a murder trial. This was slavery on trial. And the verdict would decide whether the law valued property more than life. Part 3 begins inside the courtroom where lawyers argued over whether a mother was human or owned. Where the truth threatened to tear the nation in two. And where Margaret Garner refused to be erased. Stay with me. Part 3. The knife changed everything. In one instant the law lost control of its own story. What was supposed to be a simple recovery of stolen property became something far worse. Something the nation was not ready to face. The marshals had crossed the river believing they were enforcing order. They believed the law would move cleanly and quietly the way it always did. But inside that small cabin on Mill Creek the system met a mother who refused to obey its rules. When Margaret moved toward her children the room froze. Men trained to hunt runaways stood helpless. For a heartbeat time stopped. Then Mary was gone. Silence followed. Not peace. Shock. The sound of blood hitting the floor was the loudest thing in the room. It landed again and again like a ticking clock counting down something no one could stop. Margaret stood holding her daughter as if she were still alive. Her face did not twist in grief or panic. It was steady, resolved, the kind of expression people associate with soldiers, not mothers. Then she turned toward the others. That was when the marshals moved. They rushed her from behind. The knife flew across the room. Margaret hit the floor hard. Her face scraped against the wood but she did not cry out. Robert tried to reach her and was beaten down. Simon fell. Mary screamed. The baby wailed. Chains came out. Outside the cabin neighbors gathered. Word traveled fast when violence broke the rules it was meant to protect. People whispered. Some stared in horror. Others looked away. Inside the cabin Mary's body was covered with a blanket. No prayer was said. Margaret was dragged outside with rope cutting into her wrists. Her dress was soaked. Blood marked her hands and face. She did not struggle. A marshal demanded an explanation. Asked her what she had done. Margaret answered without hesitation. She said she would rather kill her children than see them enslaved. Those words did not stay in that yard. They spread through Cincinnati, then Ohio, then the country. They reached ears that had never cared about slavery before. Margaret Garner was taken to jail. Not as a murderer but as a fugitive. As property. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Because the moment Ohio charged her with murder the law collided with itself. The trial began the next day. January 28, 1856. The Hamilton County Courthouse was packed. White columns rose high above the crowd. Every sound echoed as if the building itself were listening. People came not for justice but for answers. Something about Margaret frightened them. Something about her choice made people uncomfortable in ways they could not explain. If Margaret was property she could not be charged with murder. If she was charged with murder, she had to be human. The law could not allow both. Abolitionists filled the benches. Slave catchers stood along the walls. Ministers, journalists, and politicians pressed in close. Everyone understood this case mattered beyond one woman. Margaret sat quietly. She did not cry. She did not look at the crowd. Her hands rested in her lap. Her eyes stayed forward. Her lawyer John Joliffe stood and spoke with a voice that carried through the chamber. He argued that Ohio had the right to try Margaret for murder. That she was a person under state law. That she deserved a trial even if it meant execution. He said something that stunned the room. He said hanging would be mercy compared to slavery. Margaret agreed. She told her lawyer she wanted the murder trial. She wanted to die free rather than live owned. The federal attorneys responded quickly. They argued that Margaret was property. That the Fugitive Slave Act overrode Ohio law. That no state had the authority to interfere. They said Mary was property too. And property could not murder property. The room went quiet when those words were spoken. Newspapers printed every argument. Sketch artists drew Margaret's face. They described her eyes, her posture, her silence. Some papers called her a monster. Others called her brave. Frederick Douglass wrote that her act exposed the true horror of slavery. That no system could be moral if it drove a mother to such a choice. Harriet Beecher Stowe watched from the gallery. She later wrote that Margaret haunted her dreams. Witnesses were called. Marshals contradicted each other. Some said Margaret was calm. Others said she was hysterical. The truth shifted depending on who asked the question. Gaines testified that Margaret was disobedient. That she had always been trouble. That selling her was necessary. Margaret was never allowed to speak. Under the law her voice meant nothing. Days passed. Weeks dragged on. The courtroom grew hot with tension. People argued in streets and churches. North and South watched closely. Then the ruling came. The judge dismissed the murder charge. Margaret and her family were ordered returned to Kentucky. The law chose property. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others wept. Margaret did neither. She had expected this. She was taken back across the river under guard. Back to Maplewood. Back to chains. The abolitionists did not stop. They wrote letters, filed appeals, published pamphlets. They made Margaret a symbol even when she no longer had a voice. But symbols cannot protect bodies. Gaines kept her locked away. Isolated. Watched day and night. Robert and the children were kept on another plantation. Separation was punishment. Weeks passed in silence. Margaret told herself she had saved Mary. That death was mercy. That slavery was worse. Then came the final decision. Gaines would sell them south. Mississippi. Cotton fields. A place where people vanished. The sale was arranged quietly. No public notice. No witnesses. On March 22, 1856, Margaret, Robert and their 3 surviving children were loaded onto a steamboat called the Henry Louis. 37 enslaved people stood on deck under guard. The river moved slowly beneath them. Margaret watched the shore disappear. She did not know what waited ahead. Only that the law had won. But history had not finished with her yet. Because the river remembers. And so does the nation. Part 4 begins on the water where fate took one more turn and survival demanded a final sacrifice. Stay with me. Part 4. The river was calm when it decided to kill. On March 22, 1856, the steamboat Henry Louis pulled away from the dock carrying cotton, livestock, and 37 enslaved human beings bound for the deep south. The smoke from its stacks rose into a gray sky as the Ohio River slid beneath the hull like a slow-moving grave. Margaret Garner stood on deck holding her youngest child. The baby was quiet, too quiet. The medicine she had given earlier still lingered in the child's small body. Margaret pressed her cheek against the baby's head and stared at the water. She had crossed this river once chasing freedom. Now it was carrying her away from it. Chains clinked softly as the boat moved. Guards stood nearby with rifles resting against their shoulders. Robert stood a few feet away with Thomas and Samuel clinging to his legs. None of them spoke. Words felt useless now. The riverbanks drifted past. Towns, trees, houses where people ate breakfast and planned their day without thinking about who was being carried south beneath their windows. Margaret thought of Mary. She thought of the cabin floor. The blood. The silence that followed. She did not regret it. The Henry Louis was crowded. The enslaved were kept together under watch. Some prayed. Some stared into the water. Some whispered stories about what waited in Mississippi. Cotton fields that never ended. Heat that crushed the lungs. Whips that cut flesh to bone. Margaret listened but said nothing. Late that night another steamboat appeared out of the darkness. The Lucy Walker. It was moving fast. Too fast. Its lights cut across the water like eyes searching for something to devour. Shouts rang out. Whistles screamed. The river offered no room. The collision came suddenly. Wood exploded. Metal screamed. The impact threw bodies across the deck. Margaret lost her footing and fell hard. The baby slipped from her arms. She screamed. Water rushed in. Panic erupted. Guards shouted orders that no one could hear. Enslaved people were crushed against railings. Some were thrown into the river. Others were trapped below as the boat listed sharply to one side. Margaret crawled across the deck searching for her child. She found her floating near the edge. The baby was alive but weak. Margaret pulled her close just as the boat tilted further. Water surged over the deck. People screamed. Some jumped. Some prayed. Some vanished beneath the surface. Margaret looked at Robert. Their eyes met across the chaos. They both understood. If the child lived, she would be sold. She would be broken. She would be owned. Margaret made her final choice. She held the baby close and stepped into the river. The cold swallowed them instantly. The Ohio River closed over Margaret's shoulders, dragging her down. She fought for a moment, then released her grip. The baby disappeared beneath the black water. Margaret was pulled back by someone behind her. Hands grabbed her dress and yanked her onto the deck. She coughed water and screamed. Her body thrashed, but it was over. Her last child was gone. The Henry Louis did not sink, but it was badly damaged. Bodies were pulled from the river at dawn. Some lived. Some did not. Margaret's baby was never found. The newspapers called it an accident. They said a child was lost in the confusion. They did not say her name. They did not say why. Margaret sat in silence as the boat limped toward its destination. Her face was hollow now. Whatever strength had carried her this far was gone. Robert did not speak to her. He did not need to. Grief filled the space between them like smoke. When they reached Mississippi, they were handed over to Judge Bonham without ceremony. No one mentioned the dead child. Loss was expected. Enslaved children died often. Margaret was put to work in the fields. Cotton stretched in every direction. White rose under a burning sun. The labor was relentless. The overseers were brutal. Robert was worked until his body failed. Thomas and Samuel were sold away within a year. Margaret never saw them again. She survived only a few years in Mississippi. Some say she died of fever. Others say exhaustion. Some claim she simply stopped eating. Her death was not recorded. Her grave was not marked. But her story did not die. Abolitionists carried her name across the North. Writers spoke of her in whispers. Mothers remembered her when they held their children at night. Margaret Garner became something dangerous. She became proof. Proof that slavery did not just break bodies. It destroyed the idea of mercy. Proof that a system capable of such pain could never be defended as moral or Christian or necessary. The law tried to erase her. History tried to soften her. But the river remembered. And so did the people who heard her story and felt something shift inside them. Because once you understand why Margaret chose death over bondage, you can never unsee the truth. Slavery was not just chains and whips. It was a horror that forced impossible choices. And the nation would soon pay the price for pretending otherwise. Part 5 begins in the years after Margaret's death, when her story refused to stay buried and helped push America toward a reckoning written in blood. Stay with me. Part 5. They thought the river had taken her story with it. They were wrong. Margaret Garner was gone, but the fear she created stayed behind like a wound that refused to heal. Her body disappeared into history without a grave, without a record, without a name carved in stone. That was how America preferred its enslaved dead. Silent, forgotten, convenient. But Margaret would not stay buried. In the months after her death, her name spread quietly at first. In church basements, in abolitionist meetings, in whispered conversations between mothers who held their children a little tighter at night. People repeated her words over and over as if they were scripture. I would rather see my child dead than enslaved. Those words unsettled the nation. Slave owners were terrified of what Margaret represented. Not rebellion, not violence, something worse, moral clarity. She had exposed the truth they spent generations hiding. That slavery was so brutal that death could feel like mercy. Southern newspapers tried to control the damage. They called her insane. They said grief had twisted her mind. They described her as unnatural. As a warning, but every attempt to paint her as a monster failed. Because monsters do not make sacrifices. Abolitionist writers refused to let her story fade. Pamphlets circulated with her name printed in bold letters. Public speakers told her story to crowds who had never seen slavery firsthand. They described the knife, the courtroom, the river, and then they asked a question no one wanted to answer. What kind of country forces a mother to choose between her child's life and her child's freedom? Frederick Douglass continued to write about her long after the trial ended. He said Margaret had held a mirror to America's soul and America hated what it saw. Harriet Beecher Stowe used Margaret's story as inspiration while writing later editions of her work. She never forgot the woman who sat silent in that courtroom. Margaret became a ghost that haunted the conscience of the North. In the South her name became forbidden. Plantation owners warned enslaved women never to speak it. They feared ideas more than knives. They feared mothers who might start asking questions. What if my child deserves more? What if death is kinder? The law tightened its grip in response. Slave patrols increased. Punishments became harsher. The Fugitive Slave Act was enforced with renewed cruelty. The system responded the only way it knew how. With force. But something had shifted. Northern states began resisting the law openly. Judges delayed hearings. Sheriffs looked the other way. Communities protected runaways with growing confidence. The Underground Railroad expanded. More people were willing to break the law because Margaret had shown them what obedience supported. In Congress arguments grew louder. The issue of slavery poisoned every debate. New states threatened the balance. Violence erupted in Kansas. Blood was already being spilled before the war had a name. Margaret Garner had not caused this. But she had revealed it. She forced Americans to confront the cost of compromise. For decades the nation had balanced freedom and slavery side by side pretending they could coexist. Margaret proved that lie impossible. Because you cannot call a mother mad without asking why. Years passed. The country moved closer to war. Margaret's children never returned. Their names faded. Their fates were lost to record books that did not care. But mothers remembered. Formerly enslaved women told her story to their daughters and granddaughters. They spoke of a woman who loved her children so fiercely that she refused to surrender them to chains. They did not celebrate her act. They mourned it. But they understood it. After the Civil War Margaret's name surfaced again. Historians debated her. Ministers argued over her soul. Writers struggled to place her in neat moral categories. She resisted every attempt. She was not a hero. She was not a villain. She was a human being trapped inside an inhuman system. That is why her story still makes people uncomfortable. Because it destroys simple answers. Even today her name causes arguments. Some say she committed an unforgivable crime. Others say the crime was slavery itself. Both sides argue. Neither can erase her. Margaret Garner forces us to ask a question that never goes away. What would you do to protect your child? That question has no safe answer. And that is why her story survives. Part 6 begins when America finally breaks and the war comes. When the truth Margaret exposed explodes into open violence and the nation is forced to pay in blood for every lie it told itself. Stay with me. Part 6. The country tried to move on. It failed. Margaret Garner's story did not fade as the years passed. It hardened. It settled into the cracks of the nation like ice in stone, waiting for pressure to split everything apart. By the late 1850s America was no longer arguing quietly about slavery. It was screaming. The question Margaret had forced into the open refused to go away. How can a nation call itself free while mothers are owned? Every new law made things worse. Every compromise collapsed under its own weight. The Fugitive Slave Act turned neighbors into hunters. Free states were no longer free. Anyone could be dragged south with the right paperwork and the right amount of force. People remembered Margaret when they saw it happen. They remembered her when they watched families torn apart on northern streets. They remembered her when judges chose property over people again and again. Her story became a warning whispered from house to house. This is where obedience leads. In 1857 the Supreme Court delivered the Dred Scott decision. It declared that black people had no rights white men were bound to respect. It said enslaved people were property everywhere, even on free soil. The ruling confirmed what Margaret had already lived. Freedom under the law was a lie. The North erupted in outrage. The South celebrated. The country stood on the edge of something terrible and everyone knew it. Violence broke out in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fought with guns instead of words. Bleeding Kansas they called it. But the blood had started long before. John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry in 1859 believing violence was the only language slavery understood. Some called him insane. Others called him a prophet. Many thought of Margaret when they heard his name. Desperation breeds extremity. By the time Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 the divide was complete. Southern states began to secede. They said their way of life was under threat. What they meant was their ownership of human beings. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861 the war did not begin. It finally became visible. The Civil War ripped families apart just as slavery had. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers buried sons. Entire cities burned. Death became ordinary. But something else happened too. Enslaved people fled in massive numbers. They ran to Union lines by the thousands. Women with children crossed rivers and fields risking everything. They did not wait for permission. They remembered Margaret. They knew the cost of staying. Union generals were forced to confront the reality slavery had created. Camps filled with refugees. Mothers arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and fear in their eyes. Freedom was no longer theoretical. It had faces. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared enslaved people in Confederate states free. It was limited. It was imperfect. But it changed the meaning of the war. Slavery was no longer just the cause. It was the target. When Union soldiers marched south, enslaved people followed. Some carried their children on their backs. Some carried memories that would never leave them. Margaret Garner did not live to see this. But her story walked beside them. By the end of the war in 1865 slavery was legally abolished. The 13th Amendment ended it on paper. Chains were broken. Laws were rewritten. But the damage remained. Freedom came without land. Without protection. Without justice. Violence replaced ownership. Terror replaced law. Many former enslaved mothers still faced impossible choices. History moved on quickly. Reconstruction rose and fell. Jim Crow followed. New systems replaced old ones. The country told itself the problem was solved. Margaret was rarely mentioned. She was inconvenient. She did not fit into stories of progress and triumph. She reminded people that freedom had come too late for many. That laws had protected cruelty longer than they protected humanity. In the late 19th century historians tried to soften her story. They removed details, changed language. They called her disturbed, emotional, a product of her time. Anything to avoid the truth. But the truth survived in other ways. In songs, in oral histories, in family stories passed down quietly. Black mothers told their daughters about Margaret not as an example to follow but as a reminder of what slavery demanded. It demanded everything. In the 20th century writers returned to her story. Scholars re-examined the trial. Artists reimagined her life. Toni Morrison would later give her voice in fiction because history never allowed her to speak. Margaret Garner became a symbol again. Not of violence, of impossible love. Her story forces modern America to sit with discomfort. To understand that morality inside an immoral system breaks in unpredictable ways. That survival sometimes looks like cruelty from the outside. And that judgment is easy when you have never been owned. Margaret did not ask to be remembered. She did not leave letters or speeches. All she left was a question carved into history. What would you do when the law itself becomes the threat? That question did not die with her. It echoed through the Civil War. It echoed through Reconstruction. It echoes now. Part 7 begins when the nation tries to rewrite its past and fails. When Margaret's story is nearly erased and then pulled back into the light by voices that refuse to let her disappear. Stay with me. Part 7. They almost erased her completely. After the war, America wanted peace, not truth. The nation was exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Graves filled the countryside. People wanted stories with clean endings. Slavery was over. The country was healed. That was the version everyone preferred. Margaret Garner did not fit into that story. Her life was too raw. Her choices were too uncomfortable. She reminded people that the law had once protected something unforgivable. So history pushed her into the shadows. Textbooks reduced her to a footnote if they mentioned her at all. Court records were edited. Newspaper articles softened language. Violence became tragedy. Resistance became madness. Silence became policy. In the decades after Reconstruction, the South rewrote its past. The lost cause narrative spread through schools and churches. Slavery was described as gentle. Masters were kind. Enslaved people were loyal. Margaret's story destroyed that lie. So they buried it. Former Confederate leaders returned to power. Laws were passed to control black lives again. Voting rights vanished. Segregation became law. Lynchings became public spectacles. Freedom existed on paper. Fear ruled reality. But Margaret's name survived where official history could not reach. It lived in memory, in families, in whispered warnings passed from mother to daughter. Do not trust the law alone. Do not believe safety is guaranteed. Protect your children. Black women told her story not as legend but as truth. They spoke of her love, not her knife. They spoke of what slavery forces a heart to do when there is no escape. White America rarely listened. In the early 20th century, scholars began searching old court cases. Some stumbled across the fragments of Margaret Garner's trial. Conflicting testimonies, missing pages, edited transcripts. They noticed something strange. Too much had been removed. Why did this case receive so much attention then disappear so completely? The answer was simple. Because it scared people. Margaret shattered the idea that slavery was stable or accepted. She proved it required constant violence to survive. And violence breeds resistance. By the time the civil rights movement began in the 1950s, Margaret's story was ready to return. The nation was arguing again about freedom. About laws that claimed equality but delivered control. About whose lives were valued. Activists rediscovered her. They saw in Margaret a truth America still avoided. That systems can be legal and evil at the same time. That obedience does not equal justice. Writers, poets, and historians began speaking her name again. She was no longer just a mother in 1856. She was every person crushed by the law and told it was right. In 1987, a novel brought Margaret Garner back into public consciousness. Toni Morrison's Beloved did not retell her story directly. It did something more powerful. It captured the emotional truth. The haunting. The grief. The love that survives even when everything else is taken. Morrison showed America what history books could not. People argued again. Was Margaret justified? Could anyone understand such a choice? The debate proved the point. Margaret still mattered. Museums began including her case. Universities taught it. Students wrestled with it. Teachers struggled to explain it without simplifying it. You cannot simplify Margaret Garner. She resists comfort. She forces the listener to confront a system that turned motherhood into a battlefield. That weaponized love. That made mercy look like cruelty. In modern courtrooms, judges talk about intent and circumstance. About trauma and coercion. Margaret's case feels painfully modern. What happens when the law itself creates desperation? What happens when there are no good choices? Margaret stands at that crossroads. Her silence in court echoes louder than testimony. She did not defend herself because she refused to accept the rules of a system that denied her humanity. That is why she scares people still. She exposes the limits of legality. Today her name appears in debates about justice, incarceration, and human rights. Scholars cite her when discussing moral injury and generational trauma. Activists reference her when warning about blind faith in institutions. Margaret Garner did not start a movement. She revealed one. She showed that beneath every peaceful surface there can be buried violence. That stability built on suffering is fragile. That mothers will break the world before surrendering their children. History tried to erase her because remembering her requires honesty. It requires admitting that America protected slavery. Not by accident but by design. Margaret did not fail the law. The law failed her. And when it did, she chose love over obedience. That choice still unsettles us. Because deep down we know the truth. In the same position many would do the same. Part 8 begins when we step back and ask the final question. Not what Margaret did but what her story demands from us now. Because remembering is not enough. Stay with me. Part 8. The hardest question was never what Margaret Garner did. The hardest question was what her story asks of us now. Long after the war ended and the chains were cut on paper, America told itself it had learned its lesson. Slavery was over. The nation was reborn. Freedom had finally won. But Margaret's story would not let that ending feel clean. Because her life forces us to look beyond laws and victories and ask something deeper. What happens when a system is so cruel that love itself becomes dangerous? Margaret Garner lived in a world where the law was not protection. It was a weapon. The same government that spoke of liberty hunted her across ice and water. The same courts that promised justice debated whether she was human. That was not a failure of one man or one judge. It was a failure of the entire system. Part 8 is not about the past alone. It is about how societies decide who counts and who does not. About how easily words like order and law and stability can be used to excuse cruelty. After the Civil War, the United States changed its laws, but it did not change its habits. Control took new forms. Sharecropping replaced plantations. Convict leasing replaced auctions. Jim Crow replaced slave codes. The language shifted. The power remained. Black mothers still feared for their children. Not auctions now, but chains of another kind. Prison camps. Lynching trees. Courts that listened more to paper than to pain. Margaret's story became a quiet warning passed through generations. The law is not always justice. In the 20th century, psychologists began to study trauma. They gave names to things people like Margaret had lived without words. Moral injury. Survival response. Impossible choice. They explained something enslaved mothers already knew. When escape is blocked, the mind chooses the path that feels like protection even if it destroys everything. Margaret was not driven by hatred. She was driven by love with nowhere left to go. This is why her story still matters. It forces us to see how extreme actions grow from ordinary cruelty repeated daily. Slavery was not one moment of violence. It was thousands of small violations that built a cage around the soul. When that cage closes completely, people break through in unpredictable ways. Modern audiences often ask the wrong question. They ask whether Margaret was right. History asks something else. What made this choice possible? The answer is never one person. It is always a system that removes alternatives. That strips people of dignity until death feels like mercy. Margaret shows us what happens when a nation values order over humanity. That lesson did not end in 1865. Today we still argue about whose lives matter. About which laws deserve obedience. About when suffering becomes invisible because it is legal. Margaret Garner stands as a reminder that legality does not equal morality. She reminds us that laws are written by people and can be wrong. Terribly wrong. When students read her case for the first time, they often feel anger, confusion, discomfort. That reaction matters. It means the story is doing its work. Comfort is the enemy of truth. Margaret's silence in court speaks louder than any speech. She did not argue for forgiveness. She did not ask for understanding. She simply refused to participate in a system that denied her humanity. That refusal is powerful. It tells us something uncomfortable. Resistance does not always look noble. Sometimes it looks like despair. Sometimes it looks like a mother on a cabin floor holding a child the world refused to protect. This is why artists keep returning to her story. Pain demands witnesses. When history erases voices, art restores them. Margaret's legacy is not the knife or the river or the courtroom. It is the question she leaves behind. How far will you go to protect what you love? That question has no safe distance. It follows us into every era. When governments separate families. When laws punish survival. When people are told to trust systems that have never protected them. Margaret stands there waiting. Not asking for praise. Asking for honesty. If her story makes you uncomfortable, it should. Discomfort is the beginning of responsibility. It means you are seeing what was hidden. Margaret does not ask us to agree with her. She asks us to understand the world that cornered her. In the final chapters of this story we will look at how Margaret Garner is remembered today and why her name still refuses to fade. Why historians argue about her. Why mothers still speak of her in quiet moments. And why forgetting her would be easier but dangerous. Because when we forget stories like Margaret's we make room for them to happen again. Part 9 begins with remembrance and resistance. With how Margaret Garner became more than a woman in 1856 and turned into a permanent challenge to American conscience. Stay with me. Part 9. History tries to forget the uncomfortable stories. Margaret Garner's story refused. Her name became a whisper in the halls of power, a warning in classrooms, a quiet storm in the hearts of mothers who feared for their children. She was gone, her body lost, her life erased from official records. But her choices echoed across time, impossible to silence. By the late 19th century scholars began piecing together fragments of her trial. Newspaper clippings, court notes, testimonies that contradicted each other. They tried to make sense of it, to categorize her. Insane, violent, tragic. But none of these words captured the truth. The truth was raw, it was dark, it was human. Margaret's act in that Ohio cabin was more than desperation. It was a statement, not a statement in words, but in action. She refused to allow the system to claim her children. She claimed them first, even if it meant blood would stain her hands forever. That act terrified people. It still does. Artists and writers in the 20th century returned to her story. Toni Morrison's Beloved was the most famous. Morrison transformed history into memory, fact into feeling, showing the emotional weight of slavery without sanitizing the horror. The knife, the courtroom, the river, the children, every image burned into readers' minds. Margaret's story became more than history. It became an idea. It forced America to confront itself. To ask whether laws that deny humanity can ever be moral. To question whose lives matter when the law says they are property. Academics debated her case endlessly. Did she act rationally? Did she commit murder? Or was she simply navigating a world designed to destroy her? Every argument led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The law failed her. Society failed her. And yet she survived long enough to make a choice that no law could ever judge fairly. Civil rights leaders cited her in speeches. Mothers referenced her in warnings to daughters. Margaret became a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the impossible decisions forced on those without freedom. She was both terrifying and inspiring, both a warning and a guide. Schools began teaching her story in history classes, though often edited. The knife became symbolic. The river became a metaphor. The courtroom became a lesson in injustice. But students still understood the core truth. Margaret's world offered no easy answers. No safety, no mercy, and yet she acted anyway. Her legacy is not just for African American communities. It is for anyone who considers freedom a given, for anyone who believes law equals justice. Margaret reminds us that freedom can be fragile, that morality can be constrained by rules designed for obedience not for life. Public memory kept her alive through monuments, essays, and performances. Museums recreated the Ohio cabin, showing visitors the cold, the fear, the moment when love collided with law. Scholars published papers exploring the moral and legal paradoxes her case created. Margaret became a lens through which Americans examined the contradictions of their history. Her children, lost to history, became symbols themselves. Mary, Thomas, Samuel, and Priscilla represented the countless lives stolen or endangered by slavery. They were reminders that Margaret's act, though horrifying, was one of protection. She was defending them from a world that had already shown it could not be trusted. Even today her story is taught as a study in ethics, law, and maternal instinct. Bioethicists debate the morality of her choice. Legal scholars examine the paradox of a mother tried as a criminal yet legally property. Psychologists explore the trauma that led her to act. Every generation reconsiders her actions through contemporary lenses, proving that Margaret Garner is timeless. Margaret's story is uncomfortable because it forces us to recognize the human cost of injustice. Laws can exist to protect the powerful and destroy the powerless. Systems can be legal and evil simultaneously. Margaret's decision highlights this truth more clearly than any textbook or lecture ever could. Her story continues to influence art and literature. Plays are written about her life. Films reinterpret her choices. Music tells her story in notes and lyrics. Her existence as a historical figure grows, not because she survived, but because the questions she raised never die. Her name appears in academic syllabi alongside Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. But unlike others, Margaret is remembered for the act no one wanted to consider. The act that forced people to confront the cost of slavery not as a statistic but as a living, breathing mother willing to take unimaginable steps to protect her children. When people walk along the Ohio River today, some say you can still hear it. Not the ice groaning, not the river flowing, but the echo of impossible choices, of love that defied law, of a mother who would not surrender her children even when the world demanded it. Margaret Garner is a mirror. She reflects not only the horrors of the past but the uncomfortable truths of any society that places rules above human life. Her story asks a question that remains relevant. What would you do when the system offers only cruelty and no mercy? Part 10, the final chapter, brings everything full circle. It explores how Margaret Garner is remembered, how history has tried to silence her, and how her story continues to challenge America's conscience. It asks us to face the uncomfortable truth and consider what courage and love truly mean when freedom is stolen from you. Stay with me. The final part is coming. Part 10, final part. History remembers some names and forgets others. Margaret Garner is one of those names that refuses to be forgotten. Her story begins in a small Kentucky cabin and ends not with comfort, but with questions that still shake the conscience of America. She was a mother, a survivor, a symbol, and in that combination, terrifying to the world that had enslaved her. Margaret did not live long after her return to the Deep South. She suffered under constant surveillance, stripped of her freedom, separated from her children when it suited her owners, and haunted by the memories of what she had done. Yet her courage could not be erased. Every choice she made, every desperate act, left a mark that time could not remove. Today we remember her not for the act of violence itself, but for the impossible circumstances that created it. Margaret's life forces us to confront a truth Americans often try to avoid. Freedom is not simply the absence of chains. It is safety, dignity, and the ability to protect those you love. Margaret was denied all three. Her story has echoed through generations. Writers, artists, and historians have returned to it again and again, each time uncovering layers that were deliberately hidden. Toni Morrison's Beloved captured the emotional truth that the law could not. Court records, newspapers, and personal accounts revealed how she was both demonized and celebrated, condemned and sympathized with. Margaret Garner teaches us that history is not always about heroes or villains. Sometimes it is about people forced into choices so impossible that moral clarity becomes impossible too. She reminds us that acts of love can appear violent, that courage can be misunderstood, and that survival sometimes demands decisions the world cannot condone. Her children, the ones she fought so desperately to protect, became living reminders of her struggle. Every mother who had to navigate a world stacked against her child's safety can see a reflection of Margaret in herself. Every parent who has ever faced a choice between fear and action can understand, at least in part, the weight she carried. Margaret's name appears in academic texts, museum exhibits, and public debates about law, morality, and maternal courage. She has become more than a historical figure. She is a symbol of resistance, of love in the face of cruelty, and of the human spirit refusing to be defined by property laws. Yet there is also a caution embedded in her story. Systems built on injustice do not disappear simply because laws change. They evolve. They hide behind bureaucracies, rituals, and traditions. Margaret Garner reminds us that vigilance is required. Justice is not automatic. Freedom is not guaranteed. And humanity can be tested in ways we hope never to face. Modern audiences feel the weight of her story because it resonates beyond its time. It speaks to mothers and fathers, to children and communities, to anyone who has witnessed or endured injustice. It forces us to ask ourselves difficult questions. What would you do if the law demanded you surrender your loved ones? What choices would you make if the only alternative was unbearable? Margaret's story is also a mirror for America. It shows the consequences of valuing property over people, rules over morality, and obedience over justice. Her life and her desperate choices reveal the fragility of systems that pretend to be fair while hiding brutality at their core. Today, walking along the Ohio River, it is impossible not to imagine the ice groaning under Margaret and her family, the moonlight reflecting their fear and hope, and the impossible courage that propelled them forward. The river remains, silent yet insistent, reminding us that some choices leave ripples across generations. Margaret Garner is not a story with a happy ending. Her life did not conclude with justice, her family was not spared pain, and the system that oppressed her did not collapse immediately. But her story endures. It educates, it warns, it inspires, and it refuses to let anyone forget the human cost of slavery. Her legacy challenges us today. It asks us to remember, to question, and to act. It asks us to ensure that no system ever again places human lives beneath property, and that love and humanity are never criminalized. Margaret Garner's story is more than history. It is a call to recognize injustice, to stand against cruelty, and to honor the courage of those who survive it. If you have been moved by Margaret Garner's story, if her courage and the lessons of her life resonate with you, there are ways to honor it. Share this story. Talk about it. Let people understand the human cost behind history's pages. Subscribe to this channel to continue uncovering stories that challenge our understanding of the past and illuminate uncomfortable truths. Share this video with friends and family, so her story reaches further than it ever has before. Leave a comment telling us what Margaret Garner's story taught you, or how it made you feel. Your voice keeps her memory alive and ensures the lessons of history are never forgotten. Margaret Garner reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity can shine, and courage can survive when hope seems impossible. Her story is not over. It lives in us, in our choices, and in our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Remember her name, remember her courage, and remember that freedom is only meaningful when love, dignity, and humanity are protected for all.